If there's one thing that you take away from my 20 minutes of talking right now, it's this, that some economist came up on stage here at the ISPCS and said that people like me, social scientists, economists, political scientists, and so on, we want to be helpful. Okay, so we want to help you, the entrepreneurs, the managers, the policymakers, get this sector over the tipping point and deal with the challenges that inevitably will arise once you get over them, because that's where I think we can really earn our keep, in a sense. We want to be helpful. We need your help figuring out how we can be most helpful. Okay, and so that's the main purpose of me getting up here today, is to invite you to help us help you. We'll get to that in a little bit more detail, but I thought maybe one way to help demonstrate that a bit, and also just to have some fun with economics, since I am an economist, is to do a little game theory. Okay, so everybody knows the idea of game theory. How many people in the audience know the Stag Hunt game? Is that a familiar term? Okay, a couple folks. Stag Hunt game, I call it tipping point game theory. The Stag Hunt game is one of a few. There's like a handful of games out there. You guys have probably heard of the Prisoner's Dilemma. That's a famous one, right? I see many more nodding heads. Okay, like the Prisoner's Dilemma, the Stag Hunt game is one of a handful of games that once you see it, at least for me, life-changing. How you see the world, how you see your business, and, to be frank, your personal life. So let's do the Stag Hunt game, which I think is of quite a bit of direct relevance to this conference, to what we're here for today, and to what I'm doing up here, telling you how I think we can help. Okay, the Stag Hunt game has 3 characteristics. That's it. 2 players, each chooses whether to hunt a hare or a stag. As you can imagine, this was invented quite a while ago, because I'm not even sure. I think stag means a deer of some sort. Is that correct? Okay, so it's old-fashioned, sort of British language. Anyways, there's a hare and a stag, and the 2 players can hunt either one. So player A is in the rows. He can hunt either a hare or a stag, and player B is in the columns. He can hunt either a hare or a stag. Feature number 2 of the Stag Hunt game is that hares can be hunted individually, but stags must be hunted cooperatively. You have to hunt stags together to be successful. And the only other thing you need for a stag hunt is that stags are worth much more than hares. That's it. Okay, 3 little features. Let's put some numbers to that. So in the box, you see the payoffs of being in any one of these outcomes. So in the upper left corner, both players have chosen to hunt the hare. The first number tells you the payoff of player A, the player in the rows, and the second number, the player in the columns, player B. So in this case, they both hunt hares. You can hunt hares by yourself. You each get 1 hare. That's what it's worth to you. It's worth 1. You can think of the payoffs in terms of money, meat, whatever you want. Okay? But it's the payoff to taking those actions. Okay, so that's the first thing. The feature that hares can be hunted individually shows up if we end up in the upper right corner. So player A chooses to hunt the hare. Player B chooses to hunt the stag. Now, hares can be hunted individually. So player 1 gets his 1, just like player A gets his 1, just like before. But the stag has to be hunted cooperatively. So player B is out of luck, right? Ends up with 0, hunting the stag by himself. Of course, the symmetric case is there as well. If player B or player A hunts the stag by himself, he's out of luck and gets 0. Player B still gets the 1. Of course, the interesting thing is feature number 3. If they both hunt the stag together, if they cooperate, they each end up with 4. Much more than they do if they each go after the hare. Okay, that's the basic structure of a stag hunt game. Why is this about tipping points? Okay, so you might be thinking about that already, mulling that over in your head. Probably some of you are already there. Let's get there together. Let's talk about strategy in this game. A couple of observations in a game like this. If one player hunts hares, the other player should hunt hares. Okay, so suppose you're player A and you're looking at player B who's decided to hunt the hare. So now you're choosing between the boxes in the first column. If you decide to hunt the hare, you get 1. If you decide to hunt the stag by yourself, you get 0. So you choose to hunt the hare. Right, you follow along. Hunting the stag would be extremely risky. Right? There's some chance you were wrong, maybe, that player B was actually going to hunt the stag, and you'd end up with 4, but probably not. You're probably going to get 0. So you're going to stick with hare. The second strategic implication is that if one player hunts the stag, the other should also hunt the stag. Right? So if you're player A and you know that player B is going after the stag, now you're choosing in the second column. You can either get 1 if you go after the hare, or 4 if you go after the stag. Okay? So if one hunts the stag, the other hunts the stag. What does that mean? That means we have 2 equilibria in red and green, one much better than the other. What do I mean by equilibria? It means they're stable outcomes. So if we find ourselves in stag-stag, neither player has an interest to go to hare instead. Right? If they decide to deviate and play hare, they're going to lose out. They're going to have it 1 instead of 4. But sadly, hare is also in equilibrium. Right? If we're at hare, think about player A's choice. Should player A deviate and go after the stag? No, because player B is not going to be with him, and he's going to end up with 0. So both of these are stable. Both of these are equilibria. And that's where I hope this connects to what we're here for these last couple days, which is how do we get from the red equilibrium to the green one? How do we get over that tipping point? How do we find a way to not hunt hares, but to hunt stags? And I think probably each of you in the room has experience thinking about projects that are hares and projects that are stags. And the stag ones are riskier and require cooperation across groups. How do you make that happen? Okay, so we're going to get back to how economists think about how to get from the upper left to the bottom right corner in a game like this. But before we do that, I want to step back, because actually when Pat invited me here, one of the things she wanted me to talk about and that I think is useful is where I started, which is why am I here? What can economists and social scientists try to do to be helpful? And I put this under the title of Expect More Social Scientists at ISPCS. Okay, so Pat, if you were here at the very beginning today, Pat hinted at a relationship sort of between me and Ariane and Pat. And so that's about why am I here? So I'm a tax theorist of all things by training. That's where that's my day job. I write papers about how we should structure the tax system and more broadly the role of government in the economy. And that got me interested in industries where the public and private sectors are very intertwined. I was raised on a steady diet of Star Trek Next Generation, so as I saw the various efforts of folks like you in the room, in the media, I thought, now wait a minute, there's an opportunity. There's an industry that obviously public and private are intertwined and is interesting to students. So I looked through HBS alumni database and found Ariane and emailed her, and miraculously, she convinced her colleagues at Blue Origin to let me write a case study on their company and its relationship with NASA in the CC Dev program and COTS and so on. I should just mention, HBS teaches all by the way of case method. So we have each class is a case study of a company dealing with a specific problem that we then talk about in more abstract and broader terms. Okay, so I wrote this case study on Blue Origin. It was a remarkable experience. Blue was an amazing partner, and Ariane, of course. And then Ariane gave me this second gift because I said to her, look, I know nothing about the space sector. Where do I go to learn about this place? And she said, there's one place to go. It's Pat Hines' conference, the ISPCS. And so I came here, I think, in 2014, my first year. And she couldn't have sent me to a better place, right? So I was joking with Paul, actually, just outside. None of you have any reason to talk to me, right? I mean, I can't obviously give you anything. I'm not in your industry. I don't have a lot of money, any of that sort of thing, right? And yet, every year I come here, a remarkable generosity of spirit and intellectual openness in terms of helping me learn about this industry. And it's a really unique community. I mean, economists would be very envious of this sort of community that you guys have formed. We have very low community norms. So anyways, that's why I'm here. That's how I got here, right? But you might be thinking, and because I run into this every time I meet people here, which is I'm almost the only economist here. I mean, every once in a while there's a few other economists, right? Political scientists are very rare here. Why are there so few social scientists at an event like this? Or even interested in space in particular. And I think partly that's totally natural, right? Mostly your problems are problems of the physical sciences. The social sciences problems will come later, I would propose, in particular after the tipping point. So in some ways that's totally natural. There's also a bad explanation, which is the tenure process. So any of you who are familiar with academia knows that you got to make your way through the process. It's an industry like anything else. And working on space as a junior faculty member in the social sciences is a bad idea, okay? So even though I love space, I do not advise my junior faculty to do that yet. So there are both of those explanations, and luckily I think those are changing. Maybe not the tenure one yet, but the first one is changing, which is that I think these questions are becoming more relevant. I mean, I thought Ian's presentation is just one example of that, but actually even the panel we had up here of legal, on the legal side of things is also another signal that we are entering territory where the social questions become central to pushing this forward and keeping this going. So I think there will be more people like me showing up, and I hope that we should be showing up. I hope that we, in fact, can be helpful. We can bring things to the table that help you see your problems better, that help you solve your problems better, and move the industry forward. So a couple more slides on that, and then we'll get back to the Stag Hunt so we can have some more fun with game theory. So how we can help, I think when you think about economists in space, the first thing you probably think about is policy. And that's totally natural. So whether it's George Washington Space Policy Institute, or Greg from yesterday, or Scott Hubbard's New Space, right? There are outlets for academics like me to talk about issues of policy design. And that's our natural place to put our efforts. So there's some of that going on. I think there will just be more and more of that, which is great. But I also want to introduce an idea that's probably more novel, I think, to this group, which is, I mean, what are academics good for? Okay, so I ask myself this all too often. And I think what I've come to on this is that we have the time and the space and the resources to step back and kind of go up a level and try to provide frameworks to help you think through your everyday problems, whether you're a policymaker, an entrepreneur, whatever. And I think that applies to business challenges as well. Are there frameworks that we can provide that help you think about your business challenges and solve them? So these are just a few like early examples of things I've tried to confront. So for instance, you guys work with the public sector all the time, right? That was my first instinct on what's a problem you need our help thinking about. And so that was the case on Blue Origin, right? What are the strategic, both economic and business challenges in PPPs? And how do we think about that more generally for you guys? You work with regulators all the time, right? So the second thing that struck me as needing attention was property rights in space. So I wrote a case with Planetary Resources on what is the status of property rights in space and the legal debate over that, and what do we expect that to be when we actually start pulling things out of asteroids or the moon, right? I was talking with Karen actually after their panel yesterday, and when the rubber meets the road on this, it's going to be really quite interesting how we resolve the debates over property rights. Okay, so how do we think about that? And there we talk about John Locke and the Lockean proviso and all these things they're up a level, but that I think help clarify the context of the situation. Okay, you work with each other all the time. I mean, the Stag Hunt game is partly about this, but sometimes you work with each other on things or have to work with each other on threats, not just opportunities. And so space debris, right, getting back to sustainability, came to my radar screen pretty quickly. So I wrote a case with this awesome Singaporean startup called Astroscale that's trying to solve the space debris problem. Big problem, small company. Right, but how do we think about the tragedy of the commons, which is what that's really all about? It's all about not getting trapped in that same thing that humanity keeps getting stuck in over and over again. And we talked about Elinor Ostrom and polycentric governance and all these sorts of things that are frameworks to help think through these problems. And then finally, the one I'm obsessed with right now, and I've pigeonholed a few of you at coffee hours to talk about this, is you work with the financial sector all the time, right? So how well are we allocating capital in the space markets? What are the obstacles to better allocation of capital? Is it information? Is it time horizon? What is it exactly? If it's not being allocated well, and if it is being allocated well, how did that happen? Because it seems like a difficult place to allocate capital well. So I'm working on a case with Chad Anderson that Eric mentioned yesterday from Space Angels to think about that market. So these are just early examples. There aren't a whole lot of people at business schools yet tapped into this, but we're trying to lead the charge on this. This is where I want to make a plug for HBS shamelessly, but Ariane set me up, so I think that's okay. Look, at HBS, what can we try to bring to the table? I think what we can try to bring is that it's a place for thinking about space, a place for people to come, reflect a bit, step back a bit, talk to each other, and think about the challenges that we face as an industry. We want to be a hub for that. That means research. So the school has put money behind my research and the research of others, the case studies that I mentioned, and so on. Teaching, so we're going to try to have courses on space, starting small but getting larger, and those will be both for MBA students, so we have more people infected with the space bug that Ariane planted so many years ago, but also executives. So, people like you who are in the space industry would like to come to a business school for a week, get some basics of the business school education, and have some time to step back and think about your industry in that context. That's the kind of thing that we're hoping to put together over the next couple of years. And then unique events, by which I mean, again, these events focused on thinking about space, bring people together using these case studies as a mechanism through which to have you confront specific, pragmatic challenges to the industry. Also, thanks. Sitting in the second row here is Alyssa Hadaji, whom some of you have met already. She's my co-conspirator on these efforts, so please come up and talk with her as well as with me after this. The HBS stuff, though, is really part of a broader effort, and I've been encouraged to hear some of you talk about Boston in the context of space. I know it's not always considered a hub of space activity, although, of course, MIT is very much so. And so we are trying at HBS, as a part of a broader university effort at Harvard University, to use what is really a remarkable place in Cambridge and Boston to bring an interdisciplinary effort to space. And that means both the physical sciences, like folks at MIT, the social sciences, where Harvard has a real strength, but also humanities, right? So, it seems way out there, but what can people who study literature and history and religion tell us about space? I know it's out there, but if we're going over a tipping point, I think we can gain value from all of those things. And so we're provisionally calling it the Cambridge Space Group, but basically some idea to contribute through that broader group. And let me just emphasize again, we are super eager to link up with you guys and help. I mean, this is not a competitive thing, right? We are just trying to be helpful. Space is big, and we want to do what we can to help. Okay, in particular, let me go back now to the game, okay, how I think we can help. So let's talk about Stag Hunt. Why is the Stag Hunt an interesting game? The Stag Hunt is an interesting game because of what economists call complementarities. Okay, a complement, like peanut butter is a complement to jelly. Okay, makes it better. A left shoe is a complement to a right shoe. Neither is worth very much by itself. And each hunter is a complement to the other when they hunt stags. So if I am player A and I go out and hunt stag by myself, it's not so great. When player B joins me, player B, this is really interesting actually, player B turns out to help me even more than player B helps itself. Right? I go from 0 to 4. Player B goes from 1 to 4. Okay, so these two actors are complements in stag hunting. The problem is they don't get compensated for those complementarities if they act alone. If we're at the hare-hare equilibrium and I say, you know what, I know I have complementarities when I hunt stags, I'm going to go hunt a stag, I don't get compensated for that. Right? The market fails in this instance. I'm not going to make that move. I actually lose if I try and do that. Okay, so economists have a couple of solutions for these. What are the solutions for complementarities? I'm used to interactive discussions. What are solutions to this? Anybody got a nomination they want to put out there? I could cold call RA on, but come on, that wouldn't be very nice. That's what I do at HBS.
Player A makes a proposal to player B.
Hey, very good. What's your name?
Jed.
Jed. Awesome. That's great. What kind of proposal?
Volunteer to hunt the stag together.
Yeah. You try to coordinate, right? You try to credibly coordinate with the other player. That's very good. Okay, the other solution, I'll say it in case the government folks are too shy, is to have public incentives enter the ring, right? Have the government get involved. You could also see this as private incentives, but Jed's exactly right, private coordination. These are the two main ways, and let me just talk about them briefly. Both of these, I think, are entirely relevant for commercial space. Okay, so public or private incentives. I think this is pretty great. Okay, so suppose the government changes the payoff structure. Okay, or maybe an investor, maybe a big venture capitalist, maybe even a big player in the industry, through subsidies and taxes, okay, or through investments. In particular, the government subsidizes unsuccessful stag hunting and taxes successful stag hunting. Now, I know there's some of you in the room who, when I say tax successful stag hunting, you don't like that. I get it. I'm in a business school. Capitalism is my friend. I like the free market. You're right. Taxing successful efforts will discourage effort in certain cases. But we have to be careful, and this is one place where I think economists can help. If you're in a perfect market and you tax some effort, you discourage that effort, and that can be inefficient. But we're not in a perfect market here, right? We're in a market that's failing. And when you're in a market that's failing, sometimes things that are otherwise distortionary can actually be helpful. Economists have a thing we call this the theory of the second best. And it's super influential in economics. It's kind of like a negative times a negative equals a positive. It's not, but it's kind of like that. And that's what's going on here. Okay, so the government does this. Let's put some numbers on this. The government takes 1 from each of our successful stag hunters. So they end up with 3, and it uses that money to subsidize people who unsuccessfully stag hunt by themselves. So instead of getting 0 when you go solo, you get 2. Well, the magic of this is now the only equilibrium in the game is stag. Okay, to see that, imagine you're player A in the bottom matrix here. Suppose you think player B is going to play hare. You can have 1 if you go after the hare, or you can claim the subsidy if you go after the stag by yourself. So you're going to play stag. Now suppose you think player B is going to go for the stag. You can play hare and get 1, or you can go after the stag and get 3. So you go after the stag. So for sure, player A is going after the stag, no matter what player B is doing. Now player B knows that about player A. that player A is going after Stag. So what should player B do? Well, obviously go after the Stag. So the only equilibrium now is Stag. And what's so great about this is everybody wins. We're over the tipping point. Player A wins, player B wins, and guess what? Even the government wins because the government raised the tax revenue and never had to spend it on the subsidies. Okay? Pretty great stuff. So that's the sort of intervention that you can make in failing markets to bring about gains in efficiency, which can benefit all people. And the reason is that the government is solving the complementarities problem. The government has stepped in. Now, Jed told us that you don't need the government, and he's exactly right. Private coordination is the other one. So Jed told us that suppose A makes a proposal, right? So suppose A announces that it will hunt the stag alone. Right? Makes a public announcement and chooses to do so. Okay, now A is going to lose from that. We know that, right? That's a bad move for player A. So next time they play, what will player B do? I'm almost done, don't worry. Say A announces again that it will hunt the stag. It makes the same announcement, right? And it thinks that B will trust A and therefore also hunt the stag with some probability. And just label that probability P. It's not 0, it's not 1, it's somewhere in between. It thinks there's going to be this trusting relationship formed with some probability P. Okay, so will A honor its announcement, or will A deviate back to hare, where really it probably should do? Well, A hunts the stag again. You can work this out. I won't go through it because I'm out of time. A hunts the stag again if P is greater than a quarter. It's not rocket science, okay? But if A believes that B will trust A more than 1/4 of the time, it's worth it to abide by its announcement and go after the stag, and we'll both end up at stag. So if A is credible, they get over the tipping point together, just as Jed suggested. And what's the secret here? Reputation and repeated play, right? Which you guys have in spades. That's part of the reason the ISPCS is so valuable. You have reputations with each other, and you repeatedly play these games with each other. And so if you can make credible announcements or coordinations, you can solve problems like this. Okay, so that's the sort of economist lens on your industry, at least on the topic of this conference. This conceptual thinking on space is an example of the sort of thing we can provide. I wrote an article for economists that tries to lay this out, get more people like me interested, talking about the role of the government when there are market failures like complementarities. But so in closing, let me just say again, we are eager to meaningfully aid your efforts, and so we have an appeal, specifically. What challenges could scholars who have the time to step back and sort of search for these ideas, these frameworks, what challenges could we help you with? What companies' stories of success or failure would you find particularly interesting if we could tell them? Will we give you good lessons? And what questions do you have to set on the back burner because you're very busy people that we could take the time to help you solve? Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you also for not cold calling me. I still have nightmares of that cold call where I fell flat on my face. That's how you learn. That's how you learn, right? Reminder to everybody, please send in some questions for Matt. Why don't we go with the first one here? Yeah, there we go. Thank you for putting the website up there. Can you pinpoint some examples in the space industry of functional fixity from Gestalt's behavioral ecology theory and how to break away from it?
No, I do not know what that is. Functional fixity from I'm sorry, what does it say?
From Gestalt.
No.
I'm
sorry.
You got to be careful when you walk in here with a Harvard on your.
Well, yeah, exactly. No, I welcome challenging questions. This is a great question. So, look. Oh, my slides are gone. To this point, so if that is something that you think would be particularly useful for us to engage with, that's exactly the sort of thing I'm open to, right? It's not something I've come across in my study, but that doesn't mean it's not something we can attack and that there aren't people like me who would. So bring them on. Yeah.
As we wait for more questions, I've got a question for you, which is to what extent are you looking at how the role of the government, how it has changed over the last, let's say, 60 years? Mm-hmm. Or even before that, starting with, NACA, so NASA's predecessor. Yeah. What does that change look like, just generally speaking, and where do you think are some prior key tipping points from what you've learned?
Yeah, I mean, so in this article that I put together, I think the fundamental change that I would suggest is happening is a switch from a centralized model of space to a decentralized model of space, right, in the creation of a marketplace. So economists, many of us have what we call physics envy. And so we like to, think in terms of theorems. And there's something called the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics, okay, which is basically the Adam Smith invisible hand idea, that when you can create a competitive market with good information, you get efficient outcomes. And one way I think to think about the evolution of the space sector over the last, couple of decades is as a move from the central command structure to a more decentralized market-based structure. Not unfamiliar to all of you, of course. But that decentralization and move towards competitive markets is powerful and important, but you have to remember that the reason it wasn't that way in the beginning is because there are big reasons that markets in space don't function very well. So there will be market failures, and when does the government get involved? So if I can be provocative, there's a way to think about that the US space sector used to be organized like the Soviet Union more generally, central command. For good reason. There were public goods that we wanted to provide that would not be provided well by the market. We've now turned the table, or we're turning the table on that, to a market-based structure that will still have problems, but now the government will insert itself to solve specific problems rather than to organize the entire sector. So, long answer.
Along those lines of the role of the government, one of the challenges that our sector faces is that our programs and our projects take more than 4 or 8 years.
Yes,
not random numbers that I choose. To what extent do you think that the government can, given that, what are some of the governmental changes you think that they can instill to help us get over those? They feel like chasms every time we approach them.
Yeah, I mean, there's, of course, many proposals that many people in the room will be familiar with, so longer terms for NASA administrators. I mean, if you think about the economics context, we have the Federal Reserve Board, right? And the Federal Reserve Chair is very specifically insulated from political pressure for exactly the same reasons. We think that monetary policy should be independent from political swings, and so we isolate that function. You can imagine a similar sort of set of institutions being put in place to help insulate space policy from those sorts of swings. I think, especially to the extent that space moves from being as political as it might have been in the past. I mean, if that's possible, if it becomes more commercial and less political, that might be more possible. The contrast between monetary policy, so interest rates in the Federal Reserve, and fiscal policy, tax policy, is, I think, instructive. We don't have an institution separate from politics to decide on tax policy because it's very politically charged. As space becomes an industry that people interact with and not just a national security concern, that sort of structure might be more possible.
So a NASA administrator that lasts
Yeah.
more than 4 or 8 years,
Exactly.
or a Space Force. Any thoughts on Space Force?
I don't want to weed into the controversy on it. I guess what I would say is that there's concerns, of course, about the militarization of space and how we think about the military being active in space. The way I would look at the justification for something like a Space Force goes back to even the most basic, so even your most right-leaning economist, even your most libertarian of economists believes that you need someone to ensure the rule of law, right, and a minimally functional state. And so to the extent that we're going to go over the tipping point and have more complicated activities happening in space, having someone who can make sure that people obey the rules that we've all agreed to doesn't seem unreasonable to me. Whether it should be a separate Space Force or whatever, whether it should be US versus international, I'm not going to wade into all those things. But the idea of having a rule of law keeper in space does seem natural.
What do you think we've been talking about the role of industry and that mix there. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on, what do you think about us, Matt? What do you think about the Blue Origins of the world and the organizations that are led by people like Jeff Bezos and others?
Yeah. Well, as I'm sure many of you have thought too, I mean, there's a remarkable sense in which we have a few folks who are operating potentially a bit more like states than like private sector actors, right? So sometimes you hear people saying that, are they acting for philanthropic reasons or almost sort of passion in reasons? The other way to think about that is that they are taking steps to accomplish goals that our states are failing to accomplish, right? I mean, an analogy with that would be like the Gates Foundation and global health, right? So I mean, we think about that quite a bit, that our public sector institutions don't often address these problems we would like them to, that the market can't address, and the philanthropists step in. there's a sense in which people like Jeff and maybe Elon are playing those roles. Of course, you can't always count on them to stay there, right? I mean, they're not a state, so if they get disinterested or if something else happens, then you can't monitor that institution as well as we can a political one. So I guess that's the risk in relying on private sector actors.
For whatever it's worth, I have no hesitation that Jeff is going to be in it for a long, long time.
There you go.
This is an interesting question. So, to your stag hare model here, the 3-3 square is what you want. But if I'm an industry, I want to win. I want to get rid of my competition.
Okay.
How does that play in?
Well, I don't know. Right, of course you want to win. Win, I wouldn't necessarily, international trade is a great example, right? So I'm a free trader. I think everyone gains from free trade. And that's a classic example. It's not a zero-sum game. You don't have to beat the other guy. The other guy doesn't have to lose for you to win. And I think space is full of these sorts of things. I mean, I'm reminded of the first couple of years I came here, and there were all these questions about like, oh, does Blue Origin want to defeat SpaceX? And is this kind of like, and then I remember very early on, Jeff and I think Elon also both said, look, space is enormous. Like the more people who win, the better for all of us. And especially if we're trying to get over a tipping point. I mean, look, that's a big thing to do, and once you do it, there's a lot of surplus to be shared. So right. That's what I'd say.
Yes. Agreed there. We think, as you said, especially if we get over the tipping point, the market is going to be large enough. There's not just going to be, the Delta Airlines or the United Airlines of space or Air France. We need everybody out there. How do you see the concepts of behavioral economics play out in the space business?
That's a great question. I mean, so behavioral economics, just in case you aren't as familiar, it's like the integration of psychology into economics and thinking about the biases people bring with them just because of human psychology. There's a million of these sorts of biases. I'd say 2 jump out as sort of natural ways that you might think about them affecting our actions towards space. So the most obvious is what's called present bias, and this relates to your political question. We tend to value more things that happen right now rather than things that happen in the far future. And so particularly politically, we tend to reward politicians for short-term results, not long-term results. And that obviously interacts with the political cycle to limit our ability to make the super long-term investments. Now that can mean that the returns to somebody who's willing to invest for 50 years can be enormous, right? Because they can capture that mistake, but it can also be hard to make it actually happen. The other thing I would say is loss aversion. Humans very much dislike losing things, even more than they like gaining things. And so you might expect that in an industry that has achieved remarkable things, I mean, I think we all want to acknowledge that, of course, it can be hard to give up what you know can work to try something really new because of loss aversion. So I'd say both of those are useful.
Last quick question here. We in the space industry think that we're special, right? Of course we are. Are there other industries or sectors that are analogous in any way to what we're doing? We think of ourselves now, but certainly in the future as a public good. Are we building the, are we building the railroad? What is this?
Sure.
What are we?
I would say there's certainly historical analogs. And so many of you know Roger Lanius, and he's done this great work on historical analogs, and he's got a great book with 6 of them, so you can read all about those. I would say present day 2 jump to mind. So the first is artificial intelligence, which we've had a bit of discussion about this morning in the sense of civilizational change, right? Like really changing what the human race is all about and society. The other I would say is genetics. So some of the CRISPR technology and genetic modification could dramatically change how we think about ourselves as a species and pose some really incredibly difficult problems from a social sciences perspective as well as physical sciences or natural sciences. So those are 2 analogies.
Great. Excellent. Matt, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, everybody.
Matt Weinzierl. Thanks, Matt.